Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here with David, with Michael, with so many freedom fighters in the audience. Thank you for coming. I was asked to start today with some good news. And as a matter of fact, I have some, oddly enough. And this is it. You ready? This is all you're going to get. So, the war on terror is over. I missed the parade. Did you see it? The ticker tape down Fifth Avenue and all that. I didn't see it. But anyway, the war on terror is over. The Barack Obama administration is not speaking about a war on terror. And in fact, it's not just a matter of semantics, but he is standing down in the classic way that armies stand down after wars are over. He is indeed behaving as if the terror threat is done. To wit, you may have heard a couple days ago, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they were canceling canceling funding for radiologic bomb sensors around New York City. I mean, after all, what could go wrong? Who ever heard of Islamic terrorists wanting to bomb New York City? Coincidentally, at the very same time that this program was scrapped, there was also in the news a bomb plot that was exposed due to Bush administration Patriot Act wiretapping provisions that were able to zero in on a gentleman named Najibullah Zazi, who is a Muslim and who, in the name of Islam and the teachings of the Koran, was plotting to set off a major bomb attack at a crowded sports stadium, baseball or football, in New York City. Notably, in that plot, there was an imam in a mosque in Queens, New York City, who was an informant for the FBI. He was a moderate Muslim. He was a trustworthy voice that they depended upon for information about the Muslim community. And they came to him and they said, "Do you know this Najibullah Zazi character?" And he talked to the FBI. And then they left, and the first thing he did was pick up the phone and called Najibullah Zazi in Denver and said, "The FBI is looking for you, hide." Now, why would a moderate Muslim who is an informant for the FBI and who is somebody who was considered to be completely trustworthy and on our side in the former war on terror, why would he have done that? There is no conceptual apparatus currently available in the State Department or in the Obama administration for understanding why something like that happens. And that is only one of the failings of perception that are hamstringing our effort to resist this global attempt to subvert, as Michael very ably described, to subvert fundamental freedoms of the United States and the Judeo-Christian Western civilization, including the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience, the equality of dignity of all people before the law, the equality of rights, equality of access. All these things are threatened, and yet we have no adequate response. But we do have a response. Barack Obama outlined it on June 4th, 2009 in his address in Cairo. Now, there's several things about his address in Cairo that are noteworthy. Many things, in fact. In the first place, Obama, when he became president, he announced that he was going to make a major address in a Muslim capital to the Islamic world in an attempt to heal the friction and the conflict between the West and the Islamic world, right? Now, wait a minute. Think about that for a minute, please. All this time since 9/11, we have been told in the mainstream media that terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, right? That the terrorists are a tiny minority of extremists and every religion has its fanatics, and they have twisted and hijacked and perverted the peaceful teachings of Islam to create a spurious justification for terror attacks that has no grounding in the Quran or in Islamic teaching. Have you ever heard that? And yet, when Barack Obama wants to heal the conflict between the West and the Islamic world, the first thing he does is make an address to the Islamic world. I thought Islam had nothing to do with this. And also, it's never been before in history that an American president has done that. And there's never been a time when the President of the United States has addressed Christianity or the Christians of the world, or the Jews of the world, or the Buddhists. This was a first. It was a historic occasion in many, many ways. In his speech, which is notable in so many different ways, for so many things he said, he identified 3 causes for this conflict. And I submit to you that none of these 3 causes, which I will describe in a second, have any power to explain why that imam in Queens would have tipped off Zazi about the FBI looking for him. None of them are adequate to explain, in other words, the manifest behavior of people who are involved in terrorist activity. What he said was this. He said that the problem comes from colonialism. You remember when the United States had all those colonies in the Middle East and ruthlessly oppressed the Syrians and Lebanese and Egyptians and plundered their wealth for the sake of American purposes. You remember those colonies, right? Colonialism was one of the problems, he said, one of the sources of the conflict between the West and the Islamic world. The other was the Cold War. That during the Cold War, when the world was bipolar in all senses of the term, and everything, you were either on one side or the other, and you're either with us or against us, then the legitimate aspirations of the world's Islamic countries were ignored and shunted aside to fit into this great power grid. And the third one, he said, was the rottenness of American pop culture, beamed into by way of the internet and television and movies and so on, beamed into the Islamic world and offending the straight-laced moral sensibilities of Muslims, as if Osama bin Laden saw a Britney Spears video and he said, "I must kill." Now, those are the only causes that he identified in his speech for the conflict. And it is exceedingly strange that he did not identify at any point in his speech anything that could have arisen from the other side as a cause of the conflict. It was all our fault and all up to us to correct. It was all the responsibility of the United States. As I'm saying, these ideas do not explain the available data. And I'll give you another example. Pakistan. Barack Obama did not actually originate the idea that it's all our fault and it's up to us to correct it, and that we can do so by working to win over the hearts and minds of the Muslim world and show them by various bestowals of American dollars and building bridges and schools and so on, that we're really not such bad guys at all, and they will come to see and know us and like us. That idea is very old, and many presidents have pursued it, but none have pursued it as relentlessly and single-mindedly as Obama has. But George W. Bush certainly did. And right after 9/11, he contacted the then president of Pakistan, General Musharraf, and he offered him several $billion every year so that Pakistan would be able to fight the terrorists. The money was specifically so that Pakistan would fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and roll back these people who were responsible for 9/11. And this money duly flowed into Pakistan for 8 years. And it was revealed last year, as you probably know, that most of that money, once arrived in Pakistan, was funneled via high-placed sources in the Pakistani government to the same jihad terrorists that it was supposed to be used to fight against. And that went on for years and years. Recently, the United States House of Representatives, under the able guidance of Pelosi and Reid, and well, Reid is, anyway, you know. They met to consider this question and to consider what to do about it. And they decided to triple the aid to Pakistan. And so if I'm hitting myself on the head with a mallet and I say, "Gee, my head hurts," and then you say, "Well, I've got a cure for you. Hit yourself on the head with the mallet 3 times harder, and then you'll feel fine." I submit to you it's not going to work. And it could not possibly work. And the problem here is a conceptual one. The idea of aid to Pakistan, the idea of giving billions to the Pakistanis to fight against the terrorists, is predicated upon the idea that I explained before, that Islam does not really teach these things, that Islam has been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists who teach violence in its name, but that the vast majority of peaceful Muslims, who undeniably exist, do not believe in the same Islam that Osama bin Laden and the Taliban believe in, and that therefore we can depend upon them as reliable allies, and they will help us to fight against these people who are perverting their religion. Well, it didn't work. And I submit to you that we could have known that it wouldn't work. We could have known from the beginning and not wasted all those billions and essentially financed the efforts of our enemies if we had known what they believed. Now, this is, of course, venturing into forbidden territory. It is criticizing someone's religion. It is Islamophobic. It is hateful. It is bigoted. It's just mean. But if you read the Koran, which I happen to have with me, then you will find, I think, what are some clues to the beliefs, if not of Musharraf himself, who was a secular-minded fellow for the most part, but certainly of the elements of the Pakistani High Command that were directly responsible for the funneling of the money to the terrorists. Now, imagine if you are a pious Muslim, and Pakistan, you might know, is full of pious Muslims. So this is not a stretch. And you believe that this is the perfect and eternal book that existed forever in paradise with Allah and was transmitted in perfect form through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and now here it is. It's the supreme guidance for human behavior. And you just heard, imagine you're one of these Pakistani generals, and you just heard that Musharraf agreed to take Bush's money, American money, to fight the terrorists. And so it's time for prayers, and you go, and you know, in Islamic prayer 5 times a day, there's a part of it where you have to recite a portion of the Quran. It doesn't have to be, it's not obviously the same one all the time. You can pick, in some circumstances, you just pick one that you are fond of. So imagine that this general that we have in mind, this hypothetical general, he opens up the Quran, or he does it from memory, since in Pakistani schools you learn to memorize the Quran, and he recites, "Believers, do not take Jews and Christians for your allies. They are the allies of each other. And among you who take them for allies shall be regarded as one of them," which is not a good thing in the Islamic scheme of things. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, we have the non-establishment of religion, which is an extraordinarily wise provision because it allows for people who differ in conscience, differ in conviction on fundamental ideas of the truth and the nature of reality to coexist peacefully in harmony with one another. But because the majority of Americans are Christians in the Islamic world, America is a Christian nation. And if you are an atheist and you grew up in a Christian family, as far as most Muslims are concerned, you might meet from the Middle East or from Pakistan, you're a Christian. It's not a matter really of creed or belief or conviction. It's a matter of a kind of ethnic identity. It's your deen, your religion in the Islamic world is part of who you are. As much as you can't change being French. If you're French, you'll always be French. You can't convert to German, much as Hitler might have tried. And if you are a Muslim, of course it's forbidden to convert to Christianity, but it's also kind of seen as preposterous, that it can't really happen. It's like changing your nationality, changing your DNA. It's part of who you are. So anyway, do not take Jews and Christians for your allies. They are the allies of one another. Okay, so in the first place, maybe you are thinking, this program is not a good idea, that we're taking this money from the infidels. And you go to another verse, and you get to, 120, not 210. Dyslexia of the brain. Anyway, chapter 2, verse 120. "Never will the Jews be pleased with you, nor the Christians until you follow their way. And so here come the Americans with all this money and say, help us fight the terrorists. And there are many Islamic imams all around the world who have encountered American aid in various forms, and they have spoken about exactly this thing. Regard it with suspicion. Regard it with reserve. Take it, they tell their people, but do not enter into some sort of an alliance with these people. All they want to do is ultimately convert you to Christianity or Judaism. They do not have your best interests at heart. They want to destroy your religion and culture. So there's two strikes. They better not take the money, right? And so maybe you're this Pakistani general and you're just about to go in to see Musharraf and tell him, look, we really shouldn't take this money at all because it puts us on the wrong side of God, which is not a trivial thing if you're a believer. Another verse, though. The believers may not take the unbelievers for their allies in preference to the believers. The believers, the Muslims, may not take the unbelievers, non-Muslims, for their allies in preference to the believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah. That's a very serious thing. It has nothing to do with Allah. Unless he does so in order to protect himself from their wrongdoing. Unless he does so in order to protect himself from their wrongdoing. What does that mean? Well, don't take my word for it. I have this very nice Koran with me. I picked this up in London. A few weeks ago I was in London and I went on a tour, a mosque tour. I know that's not what you usually do in London, go see the mosques, but that's my idea of fun. And I was at the Finsbury Park Mosque, which you may have heard of. A few years back, it was the center of activities for Abu Hamza al-Masri, who is known as Captain Hook. He's the fellow, the jihad terrorist. He has a hook for a hand, and he's got one of his eyes poked out. He's a very scary-looking guy. And he was preaching jihad and hatred and warfare against non-Muslims in this Finsbury Park Mosque. But now he's in prison. And so I went into the Finsbury Park Mosque, and they were very happy to see me. That might surprise you, but they didn't know who I was. And they were very happy that an unbeliever was coming in, full court press, trying to convert me, gave me this very nice Quran. And I said, I hear there was some trouble here a few years back, eh, guys? Gosh, what happened? And he said, yeah, there were some bad people here, and they were doing bad things, but now it's all over. And now we are peaceful, and we love England, and so on and so on. And he gave me this peaceful and moderate Quran. Now, this peaceful and moderate Quran is a very nice English edition with commentary by Sayyid Abdullah Maududi, who was a Pakistani jihad theorist of the 20th century, very important figure. If you go to an Islamic bookstore in this area, and I'm sure there are plenty, then you will find Maududi's writings. If you go to islamicbookstore.com online, you will find Maududi. Very internationally influential theorist of political Islam. And Maududi explains this verse. Remember, we're talking about the verse that says, the believers may not take the unbelievers for their allies in preference to the believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah, unless he does so in order to protect himself from their wrongdoing. So how does Maududi, internationally renowned Islamic authority, explain that passage? He says, this means that it is lawful for a believer, helpless in the grip of the enemies of Islam, and in imminent danger of severe wrong and persecution, to keep his faith concealed, and to behave in such a manner as to create the impression that he is on the same side as his enemies. Did you hear that? Should I read that again? To create the impression that he is on the same side as his enemies. Now, Maududi did not invent that idea. That's the commonplace mainstream understanding of that passage. And it is a deeply rooted idea in Islam that under pressure, as Musharraf undoubtedly was when 9/11 happened, then you can pretend to be on the side of your enemies. But the pretense was clear. Now you might say, well, you're just proof texting. You're hypothetical here. This is not a real general. You're not really showing us that anybody reads this stuff and takes it seriously. Well, very well then. But it does explain the available facts in a way that Obama's construction does not. It does explain why it is that they took our money for so long and yet betrayed us and gave it to the people they were supposed to be using it to fight against. And it certainly is true that the book is taken very seriously in the Islamic world. And that even if I do not have a general who is using these texts that I just quoted to you and explained, there are certainly plenty of jihadist writings that quote the Quran and that explain what they're doing by virtue of the Quran. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 mastermind. You know the guy who, the famous picture of him with his hair all crazy and the t-shirt, and he just woke up and he's getting arrested. He looks like my brother in that picture. But anyway, I saw my brother like that many times in the early mornings, even if he wasn't arrested. But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other plotters, they recently wrote a letter. A few months ago, they wrote a letter to the judge in their case. And they explained with copious passages from the Quran that they were doing what they understood to be their Islamic duty. But there was one thing that they said that stuck out that nobody noticed, that was extraordinary. And that was that he said, we have the religious duty to fight you because of your infidelity. But we are fighting you now because of these various grievances, and then he trotted out his laundry list of all the evils of America, which Barack Obama shares. But notice that. It would be our duty to fight you for your infidelity alone. And the Quran actually does say to fight against the Jews and the Christians until they convert to Islam or submit to Islamic rule. And it never says, fight the Jews and Christians who have offended you with colonialism, or fight the Jews and Christians whose foreign policy you find objectionable, or fight the Jews and Christians who in some way have sinned against you so that you have a grievance. It says, fight the Jews and Christians, period. The implications of that are this. Barack Obama thinks that he can, by various concessions, by various accommodations, by various gestures of goodwill, blunt the force of the jihad against the West. But ultimately, Osama bin Laden said it best on October 6, 2002, in his letter to the American people. He said, the first thing we are calling you to is Islam, which is completely in line with the Quran's injunction to fight against Jews and Christians, period, full stop. And it means, in other words, that no amount of goodwill showing, no amount of accommodation, no amount of concessions is going to do anything to keep at least some Muslims from considering that they have a religious duty to fight against us. And they will keep going. Now, of course, talk about financing your own destruction. We're paying for this by means of the Saudi oil money, not only in Pakistan. And there has been no effort really to free us from that, although, of course, there are the familiar tropes about the Alaskan reserves, the offshore drilling, all these things. A president that was really concerned about national security would be doing that, because he takes away the money that they have to finance this, then it's going to be a lot less formidable than it appears now. But right now, the Saudis are financing not just terrorism, although they're certainly doing that, but they are financing efforts of dawah, which is Islamic proselytization. Now, Islamic proselytizing is very interesting and something that you need to be aware of. Islamic proselytizing, in the first place, is a duty for Muslims, as it is for Christians, to try to spread the faith. But you know those the Baptists who might knock on your door, or the Mormons who will knock on your door? If you tell them, no thanks, I don't really want to convert, they'll go away. They won't slash your tires. They won't throw a brick through your window. They will be very polite, and they'll leave. They might come back, but that's it. Now, in Islam, in the Quran, and in the teachings of Muhammad, he says, first invite the unbelievers to accept Islam. If they accept it, then don't fight them. If they refuse, then invite them to pay the jizya, which is the tax, that is the hallmark of the second-class status that is mandated for non-Muslims in the Islamic society. And if they refuse both of those, then go to war. And so it's like the nice boys come to your door and they ask you to convert, and you say no, and then they shoot you. Or they slit your throat. Now, I'm not saying this is literally happening. Obviously, it's not. But it is nonetheless something that here again proceeds from an understanding of what is happening from the beliefs of the people who were proceeding along these lines. And so in other words, when Barack Obama wants to make all these concessions to the Islamic world, he's doing so based on an ignorance or a willful denial of the fact that there is this imperative to fight on against us no matter what we do. No matter how nice our foreign policy becomes, no matter if a Palestinian state is established with contiguous borders, it ain't going to end anything. So, if all that effort is useless, and if billions spent for anti-terror efforts in Pakistan are useless, and if other efforts at conciliation are useless, is it all lost? No, certainly not. Because in a free exchange of ideas, which is of course rapidly being challenged, did you know that Barack Obama actually reversed Bush administration policy at the United Nations in regard to the criminalization of Islamophobia? That there every every year, the Organization of the Islamic Conference puts through a resolution at the UN at the UN Human Rights Council to criminalize criticism of Islam. They talk about defamation of religions, but Islam is the only one ever mentioned. Now, what is criticism of Islam? Everything I've told you about Islam today is true. So is that criticism? Is that hate? They would say so, yes. As a matter of fact, specifically specified in the OIC resolution draft was the criminalization of counter-terror efforts that purported to explore the motives and goals of the terrorists by looking at the Koran. The Bush administration had opposed this resolution year after year, and it passed. But then they would veto it. Obama had the United States co-sponsor it with Egypt, and it passed last week with United States sponsorship. Now, you might think, well, we have the First Amendment, so he can't pull that here. It's just a fig leaf. It's just an empty gesture. But for the first time, we have the President of the United States and the government of the United States in an international forum saying that United States law is wrong and ought to be changed, essentially. They're not saying that directly, but by sponsoring this kind of legislation, they are saying it. The upshot would be, of course, to render us mute and defenseless in the face of the Islamic Jihad advance. You can't talk about it. You can't devise ways to resist it. Right now, even to talk about what I'm talking about now is on the outer limits of political incorrectness, and most people don't dare, including some of your favorite conservative hosts. You know, they don't dare talk about these things. But if we don't talk about them, if we don't talk about them as a society, if we don't resist the efforts to curtail free speech and the Obama administration's opposition, manifest opposition to free speech, and if we don't start speaking realistically about the Quranic imperatives that fuel this struggle, then all is lost. Because obviously you can't defeat an enemy that you can't know, that you don't understand, that you refuse to understand, unless you can't devise any kind of comprehensive response to his challenge. But all is not lost. As long as there is life, there is hope. As long as we stand for the civilization that is the greatest civilization on earth, and we should say that unapologetically, and say that we stand for these principles of human rights that many Muslims live by and value. They're just afraid to stand up and say so because they know what would happen if they did. But if we were a more certain trumpet ourselves, there would be many who would rally to the standard. And if we were standing more firmly for human rights, for the non-establishment of religion, for the equality of rights of all people, for the freedom of speech and the freedom of conscience, then there would be a tremendous support even among Muslims for what we are doing. But pretending, building policy, fantasy-based policy making, building policy upon fictions, upon misapprehensions is simply the road to disaster. And so what I would leave you with today is that I would say the fundamental thing that is imperative to do in opposing the Obama administration is to try to educate legislators on our own side, to speak about these issues more intelligently, and to devise legislation that helps us to fight it more effectively. And that should be a high priority in any kind of strategizing for 2010 and 2012. Thanks very much.